Welcome, everyone. I'm Vajra Ma, chair of the steering committee of the U.S. chapter of the Women's Human Rights Campaign, and I'll be your moderator today. Thank you for being here. I'd like to do a quick orientation and a little housekeeping before we get started. This webinar is being brought to you by the Women's Human Rights Campaign USA, the U.S. chapter of the WHRC, an international organization dedicated to protecting women's and girls' sex-based rights. WHRC is a nonpartisan organization. Our founding document, the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights, reaffirms women and girls' sex-based rights and challenges the discrimination we experience from replacing the category of sex with that of gender identity. We expect our webinar to last between 60 to 75 minutes. We have 4 presenters whom I will introduce as we go along. I'd like you to know that we have disabled the chat box, and after the presentation, we will have a Q&A. And during the presentation, you can put your questions into the Q&A feature found on your Zoom screen, and we'll do our best to get to all your questions. Please restrict this to questions and not statements, and don't use the Q&A as a chat box. We are here today to give you a comprehensive overview of the Equality for All Act. You can find the Equality for All Act at the website www.womensdeclaration.com, and then go to our country page, and you'll find the text there. The Equality for All Act is our response and alternative to the proposed Equality Act currently before the US Congress, which is an unmitigated disaster for women and girls. The so-called Equality Act is inconsistent with Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972, and it violates the Equal Protection Clause of the US Constitution. Needless to say, it is also entirely incompatible with the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights. And yet, Joe Biden, President-elect, has vowed to pass the so-called Equality Act within 100 days of taking office. And I want to mention the date of this webinar today is December 17th, 2020. WHRC USA believes that the only way to stop this is to introduce a stronger bill. And to that end, we have developed the Equality for All Act, or EFAA for short. We're very glad to have you here for this presentation. So let me introduce our first presenter, Carrie Bruss. Carrie Bruss is a retired nurse, proud mother of 2, and a lifelong feminist. She has served on the interim steering committee of the WHRC's US chapter since its inception and is passionate about defending women's sex-based rights. Carrie also serves as a US country contact for the international organization. Today, she will be discussing the background of how the Equality for All Act came to be written, as well as what our thought process and goals were and are for the bill. Carrie?
Thank you, Vajra. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this discussion. I'll start off by sharing a bit of background. As many of you may be aware, the current version of the Equality Act, also known as HR 5, would add gender identity to the list of protected characteristics in US civil rights law. Doing so would completely negate the existing sex-based rights of women and girls. Let me repeat that. Enshrining gender identity in US civil rights law would completely negate the existing sex-based rights of women and girls, who for decades have been recognized in law as an oppressed sex. And while HR 5 claims to add protections for sexual orientation, which are both necessary and long overdue, in reality, the bill itself is homophobic in that it conflates sex and gender. Sex is biologically determined at conception observed and recorded at birth, and is both binary and immutable. Gender, on the other hand, is nothing more than sex-based stereotypical roles that society rigidly expects women, as well as men, to conform to. Furthermore, the Equality Act, as written, is inconsistent with Title IX and the Equal Protection Clause of the US Constitution, as Vajra mentioned prior. It is also entirely incompatible with the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights, which I will remind those not familiar with our organization's founding document, challenges the discrimination women experience from the replacement of the category of sex with that of gender identity. Earlier this year, Lauren Levy, a declaration signatory and volunteer with our US chapter of the International Women's Human Rights Campaign, presented her concept of an Equality Act rewrite that would stay as close to the original Act's text as possible, while using language that actually would protect those that the original Act merely claims to. However, after much internal discussion and debate, we decided that it was necessary to build on Lauren's original work and proceeded to implement the following changes in the development of our proposed Equality for All Act. 1, we completely eliminated the term gender identity from the bill and instead replaced it with nonconformity to sex-based stereotypes. 2, we added the words "of a female person" to follow the phrase "or on the basis of pregnancy, childbirth, or related medical condition," wherever it appeared in the original bill. 3, we removed any references to transgender or queer, while we maintained references to lesbian, gay, and bisexual persons. 4, we replaced the phrase sex, including sexual orientation and gender identity, with sex, sexual orientation, and nonconformity to sex-based stereotypes, wherever it appeared in the original bill, as we felt strongly that all three should stand alone as equally protected characteristics as opposed to as qualifiers. And finally, 5, we provided clear, non-circular definitions for any terms the bill referenced. As a result, we believe the EFAA is a much stronger and definitive bill that would in fact prohibit discrimination on the basis of sex, sexual orientation, and nonconformity to sex-based stereotypes. We are very proud of our work, and our hope is that this amended bill will be introduced to Congress as an alternative to the current version of the Equality Act, which does none of the above, and would indeed be an unmitigated disaster for women and girls were it to be signed into law. Thank you.
Thank you, Carrie. Our next presenter is Kara Dansky. Kara is a feminist and an attorney. She is the chair of the Committee on Law and Legislation of the International WHRC and serves on the interim steering committee of the WHRC's US chapter. She has also worked on criminal law and criminal justice policy for over 20 years. She earned her bachelor's degree at Johns Hopkins University and her JD at the University of Pennsylvania Law School. Kara today will be discussing the importance of protecting biological sex in the law. Kara.
Thank you, Vajra. Thank you, Carrie, for your introduction, and thank you all for being here. As Vajra said, my objective here today is to explain why it is important to protect women and girls in the law, specifically on the basis of sex, as the Equality for All Act does, and why the inclusion of so-called gender identity is a threat to those protections. First, I will offer a very short overview of what the word sex means and why it matters. Human beings are, of course, Homo sapiens within the order of primates, the class of Mammalia, and the kingdom Animalia. We are, in short, animals, and within that category, mammals. Sex determination throughout the class of Mammalia is commonly known and well understood. In short, sex is determined by the presence or absence of a Y chromosome. Cells in female mammals contain two XX chromosomes, and cells in male mammals contain an X and a Y chromosome. Occasionally, individual mammals are born with sex chromosome anomalies, but the sex of these individuals is always determined by the absence or presence of a Y chromosome. A single gene, known as SRY, is solely present in the Y chromosome. The presence of this gene is sufficient to cause male development. In male embryos, the SRY gene activates a testes-forming pathway at about week 7 of development. In female embryos, which do not contain the SRY gene, ovaries develop. The ovaries then produce estrogen, which triggers development of the uterus, cervix, and other primary sex characteristics. The reason that all of this matters for purposes of our discussion today is that women have historically been discriminated against in the law and throughout society precisely on the basis of our female sex. Take, for example, jury service. William Blackstone, a renowned English jurist in the 18th century, argued that women should be categorically excluded from jury service based on the defect of sex. And that exclusion was initially built into the legal systems of every US state. In 1880, in a case called Strouder versus West Virginia, the all-male Supreme Court expressly stated that states may constitutionally confine jury service to males. In 1961, a woman named Gwendolyn Hoyt was convicted by an all-male jury of second-degree murder after killing her abusive husband. She had pled temporary insanity at trial, and the men on the jury rejected that defense. Her state, Florida, had a system in place in which men were automatically placed on jury rolls, but women specifically had to opt into the system if they wanted to serve, resulting in many fewer women being available for service than men. She argued before the US Supreme Court that this system was unconstitutional. In rejecting her claim, the unanimous all-male Supreme Court stated that Florida's system was constitutional because woman is still regarded as the center of home and family life. At that time, although 47 states permitted women to serve on juries under various legal structures, Alabama, Mississippi, and South Carolina still categorically barred women from serving on the basis of sex. It wasn't until 1975 that the US Supreme Court ruled that discrimination on the basis of sex in jury service is unconstitutional. Interestingly, it did so in a case in which a man was convicted of kidnapping and robbing a woman, her daughter, and her grandson, and of raping the woman. Or let's take a look at the educational arena. In 1873, Dr. Edward H. Clark of Harvard Medical School published a book called Sex in Education, in which he stated that, quote, identical education of the two sexes is a crime before God and humanity, that physiology protests against, and that experience weeps over. The next year, Henry Maudsley, a British psychiatrist, in an article called Sex in Mind and in Education, stated, quote, it is not that girls have no ambition, nor that they fail generally to run the intellectual race in coeducational settings, but that they do it at a cost to their strength and health, which entails lifelong suffering and even incapacitates them for the adequate performance of the natural functions of their sex. In 1848, Charles Meigs, an American obstetrician, published a book called Females and Their Diseases, in which he argued that after 5 or 6 weeks of mental and educational discipline, a healthy woman would lose the habit of menstruation and suffer numerous ills as a result of depriving her body for the sake of her mind. I pulled all of that information from Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg's opinion in the case of United States versus Virginia, which concerned the then male-only Virginia Military Institute. Of course, today, American women and girls technically have equal access to educational institutions because of Title IX. But those of us who study the topic of gender identity know that Title IX is under threat from boys and men who claim to be actual girls and women. Notably, Democratic Representative Tulsi Gabbard recently introduced a bill to clarify that the law protects women and girls on the basis of sex, at least in Title IX funded sports, and we encourage all lawmakers on either side of the aisle to support her. I could provide numerous additional examples of discrimination against women in the law and society, but the point here is to simply demonstrate that throughout US history, women and girls have been discriminated against as women and girls on the basis of sex in the law and elsewhere. The achievements that we have attained to remedy centuries of discrimination against American women and girls on the basis of sex were accomplished by feminists and male supporters, but including so-called gender identity in the law, as the current version of the Equality Act would do, would eradicate all of these gains by protecting so-called gender identity as a category. Instead, the Equality for All Act is a much stronger bill in that it would explicitly protect women and girls on the basis of sex in order to remedy these centuries of discrimination that we have experienced on the basis of sex. Women and girls deserve at least that much. I would like to share a quote from Josephine Bartok, a UK feminist and journalist. It comes from a recent article about the Scottish government's recent decision to replace the word gender with the word sex in a law that is designed to allow rape victims to request to be examined by a female medical professional. Some objected to the proposed amendment on the basis that it would prohibit male medical professionals who claim to identify as women from performing invasive vaginal examinations on women who had survived rape. In the year 2020, people are literally arguing that female rape victims should be forced to be examined by men against their will. Thankfully, the amendment passed. As Josephine states in her article, quote, "Last Thursday, Parliament did their job and ensured that traumatized women in Scotland would not become props to support the gender identity of men, but that removing this most basic right to be examined by someone of the same sex was even raised as a possibility should set alarm bells ringing. The speed at which the ideology of gender has captured institutions and governments gives an indication as to the sex of those who benefit. As 2020 draws to a close, women are no longer pushing for equality. We are fighting for basic legal recognition as a sex, and at serious risk of having our rights virtue signaled away. If Congress enshrines so-called gender identity in the law, American female rape survivors will have potentially no ability to avoid having to be examined by a male doctor. When in the past, states have proposed mandating transvaginal ultrasounds for women seeking abortion, women have rightly stood up and said no. It's hard to see how allowing a man to vaginally examine a woman against her will is any better than that. In contrast to sex, gender is a set of sex-based stereotypes, which Lauren will be discussing in greater detail. Also in contrast to sex, so-called gender identity is not grounded in material reality and has no coherent definition, and thus should not be enshrined in law. If gender identity means anything at all, it means identification with a set of harmful sex-based stereotypes. However, because these stereotypes are harmful, enshrining them in law in a manner that protects a person's identification with them serves to reinforce them. There is simply no valid justification for Congress to reinforce a set of sex-based stereotypes that harm women and girls. So-called gender identity is nothing more than a regressive political movement designed to enforce sex-based stereotypes that have no place in contemporary society. All of so-called gender identity ideology rests on the notion that it is possible to have the brain of one sex inside the body of the opposite sex. But even that concept rests on the notion that there is such a thing as sexed brains, and there isn't. In conclusion, we urge all US House representatives and senators to consider introducing this important piece of legislation when Congress convenes in January. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kara. Thank you for highlighting the importance of protecting biological sex in the law. Our next presenter is Marianne Rutigliano. She is a physician, and her work is in evaluating research on the effects of toxic chemicals on human health and environment. She has been out as a lesbian for over 50 years. Today, Marianne will be discussing discrimination based on sexual orientation as it is addressed in the EFAA, the Equality for All Act. Marianne.
Hi, good evening or afternoon, depending upon where you are. We're going to talk about discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, and that discusses what do homosexuals, and I know some people find that word controversial, but I want to say it up front because it really stresses the fact that sexual orientation is based on the biological reality of sex. So what do homosexuals, lesbians and gay men experience that would be protected under the EFAA? You know, I've been out as a lesbian for over 50 years, so I can certainly speak from my own experience as well as more universally. And if you are a lesbian or gay man, you will have experienced a lot of the same things. We all will have experienced a lot of the same things. There are 4 particular areas in which lesbians and gay men require protection from discrimination that are mentioned in the EFAA. And there's a whole host of areas, but these 4 really kind of stand out. Number 1, discrimination may have more than one basis. A pregnant lesbian may be discriminated against based on her sex. She's female, she's a woman, on her sexual orientation, lesbian, and on the pregnancy itself. And again, that's because she's female, woman, that's who gets pregnant. And so she's discriminated against based on 3 things: sex, sexual orientation, and pregnancy, in what is really a kind of a grim trifecta of discrimination. Gay men can experience this overlap as well. The discrimination may be on the basis of sexual orientation, gay man, as well as sex-based stereotypes if the man does not conform to conventional hypermasculinity. And gay men who do not conform to this hypermasculinity, to these conventional sexual, do suffer discrimination on the basis of that as well as their sexual orientation itself. So that's something that as you know, lesbians and gay men, we mostly know about because we've all experienced it or know people who've experienced it. Number 2, discrimination in public accommodations. Now that can take many forms. Very obviously, there's been a recent court ruling in the state of Michigan that a business can refuse to serve homosexuals, can refuse to serve lesbians and gay men. You can go into a restaurant and it will be perfectly legal there for them to refuse to serve you because you are homosexual. Less obvious, except to lesbians and gay men who've experienced it, is violence. Violence that is specifically directed against someone because of their sexual orientation. Now, when I was younger, many years ago, I used to go to lesbian bars. There used to be a lot of them, in fact, and the bars would close late. This was in New York, so a lot of the bars would close as late as 4 a.m., you know, where I lived. So you could be going out to your car, and a lot of us would try to drive if we could. It was just safer and you were getting out late. You'd be going out to your car very late with not many people around. And if you parked too close to the bar, men, and it was virtually always men, would smash up all the cars parked very close, vandalize them, smash them up, because they figured that the cars belonged to lesbians, and a lot of the cars did. But if you parked far away enough so that you wouldn't be vandalized, your car wouldn't be vandalized, men would stalk and follow you on your way to your car, and women were attacked. And they were attacked specifically because they were lesbians. There are other public accommodations where lesbians and gay men may experience discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. Shelters. Gay men in particular will experience this difficulty and discrimination in shelters based on the fact of their sexual orientation. And again, if they do not conform to the hypermasculinity sex role stereotype for men. Shelters, healthcare, youth services, and for same-sex couples, renting an apartment or buying a house together. People have experienced going to rent an apartment and being told no for no particular reason, but kind of, having a series of gay couples be told no, and then all of a sudden a straight couple gets told yes. This is not an uncommon scenario. So public accommodations, and there are a whole host of others as well. Number 3, employment. Now, some employers are great. They promote a positive culture at work for all employees. They specifically address sexual orientation, and that's fantastic. But even employers who do promote that positive culture will have individuals who work there who are negative or bigoted toward lesbians and gay men, and may work to sabotage the work for lesbians and gay men, or to create such an insidiously hostile workplace covering for each other that the lesbian or the gay man simply quits. On a personal note, I have seen it happen more than once or twice. Workplace discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation also has the deleterious effects of affecting mentorship and advancement opportunities, which can stymie career development. So that's a huge deal. I mean, ultimately, people can be fired on the basis of sexual orientation, and it may not be overt, but it may be very, very, very subtle, and it may have to do with, sabotaging work. It's hard to prove, but if you're a lesbian or gay man, you may have experienced it yourself, and you may certainly know somebody who's experienced it. And finally, the concept of conversion therapy, and we're going to use air quotes when we talk about conversion therapy as therapy. The idea of conversion therapy, remember those quotes, was to take homosexuals, lesbians and gay men, and to convert them to heterosexual rather. Take homosexuals, convert them to heterosexual. But this conversion, so-called therapy, really has never been shown to be very effective. Many of the supposedly converted ultimately recognized that they were not straight. And, if you've got a sense of what your sexual orientation is, you may indeed feel very sure that that's really what you are. And I assure you that lesbians and gay men know what we are. So the idea of banning conversion therapy originally was that if a kid told someone, like a parent or a teacher or a therapist, that she or he is lesbian or gay, that the therapist should not automatically focus on trying to make the kid heterosexual. That was what it meant, and that was a good, compassionate thing to ban conversion therapy, so that you didn't just automatically take a kid and try and convert them to be heterosexual. Now, this is not a question of immediately affirming what a child says either. Instead, the therapist talks with the child at length to explore feelings, errors of fact, preconceived notions, social and school difficulties, and any mental health issues. It's a process of verifying and then helping a child to grow to be a happy, healthy lesbian or gay man. This concept, though, has now been applied to kids who tell therapists that they are trans. The confounding issue here is that many kids who say that they are trans do so because of severe homophobia and lesbophobia, either at home, at school, or in their peer groups. Therapists need to be able to discuss this and find out if this is really just a terrorized lesbian or gay kid. This is underscored by the finding that the vast majority of incipient lesbian gay kids who are directed down the trans path would otherwise grow into those happy, healthy lesbians and gay men if they were just supported in their emerging sexual orientation and left to grow naturally as themselves. So conversion therapy bans need to protect these kids, And the EFAA is really about protection. Protection, in this case, in terms of sexual orientation. It's to protect the sexual orientation of people who really do want to live their lives without asking the rest of the world to change how they live theirs. Thank you.
Thank you, Marian. Thank you for highlighting the discrimination that lesbian and gay men receive because of their sexual orientation, not receive, but are bombarded with because of their sexual orientation, and that the EFA provides protection against that discrimination. I also want to remind you that you can put your questions in the Q&A as they come up, and we'll get to those when we get to that time. So you can, at any time you want to add a question to the Q&A, please go ahead and do that. Our next and last presenter is Lauren Levy. Lauren is a retired lawyer. She has been an activist working for women's rights and lesbian rights for more than 50 years and contributed significantly to the creation of WHRC's Equality for All Act, as Carrie Bruss commented earlier. Today, Lauren will be discussing the protection of equal civil rights for people who do not conform to sex-based stereotypes. Lauren.
Thanks, Vajra. So it was the late 1980s, and Ann Hopkins worked as a senior manager at an accounting firm in Washington, D.C. Of the 662 partners, only 7 were women. Hopkins was proposed as a partner in the firm. Decision was deferred for a year, but the following year, the employer failed to reconsider her. According to the partners who were reviewing Hopkins' performance, she had both positive and negative attributes. In the positive column, employer evaluations included phrases such as outstanding performance, deft touch, extremely competent, strong character, intelligence, and integrity. Comments from clients included strong and forthright, very productive, energetic, and creative. On the other hand, some partners also described Hopkins as overly aggressive, unduly harsh, difficult to work with, and impatient with staff. And some criticism was overtly gendered, macho, overcompensated for being a woman. One superior advised her to take a course at charm school. A partner who supported Hopkins said she had matured from a tough-talking, somewhat masculine, hard-nosed manager to an authoritative, formidable, but much more appealing lady partner candidate. For litigation purposes, what turned out to be the coup de grace for employer Price Waterhouse was this advice given to Hopkins by a partner. Walk more femininely, talk more femininely, dress more femininely, wear makeup, have your hair styled, and wear jewelry. Citing the United States Constitution and Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the United States Supreme Court ruled that Price Waterhouse had engaged in impermissible workplace discrimination on the basis of sex and had ruled in favor of Ann Hopkins. I think it's reasonable to infer that the court considered and rejected the traditional notion that women are inherently feminine and men are inherently masculine, or alternatively, that everyone has a duty to society to conform to an assigned sex role, and that if a woman in particular fails to conform to what convention calls feminine personality traits, that her employer can treat her nonconformity as a character flaw that can legitimately be discriminated against. Price Waterhouse explicitly interpreted sex in Title VII to prohibit workplace discrimination on the basis of plaintiffs' unfeminine presentation and behavior. The enforcement of sex role stereotyping is inconsistent with equal rights based on sex because femininity is the performance of submission, while masculinity is dominance. If women are to achieve equal civil rights with men, the law needs to protect both women and men from the enforcement of both femininity and masculinity. To be clear, sex role stereotypes exist independently of the sex of the person performing them. A man can perform femininity and a woman can perform masculinity. people of both sexes need protection from any requirement to conform to either set of sexual stereotypes. Unfeminine is not the same as masculine, and vice versa. In reality, nearly all people deviate to some extent from the stereotypical model of either sex role, and any such deviation must be protected by law. As federal civil rights law and case law stand presently, without an Equality Act, there is incomplete protection from sex-based stereotypes. The Equality Act that passed the House of Representatives as H.R. 5 is an attempt to expand protection from discrimination to cover more classes of people and also more kinds of situations. H.R. 5 tries to provide protection against enforced sex role stereotypes, but fails because it simultaneously tries to protect gender, which is sex role stereotypes, with the result that H.R. 5 is completely incoherent with respect to sex and gender. The Equality for All Act, proposed by WHRC USA, corrects this confusion while providing comprehensive, clear, precedent-based, and enforceable protection for non-conforming people of both sexes. H.R. 5 defines gender identity. That's the House bill, right? H.R. 5 defines gender identity as the gender-related identity, appearance, mannerisms, or other gender-related characteristics of an individual, regardless of the individual's designated sex at birth. So in the first instance, it defines gender identity as gender identity, or one or more of the listed types of behaviors. The primary definition is the one that would differentiate gender identity from sex role nonconformity, but it's a circular non-definition. Looking elsewhere for definition, I found this at healthlines.com. Gender has to do with who someone knows themselves to be. I think that definition reflects common usage. In the interest of accuracy, I'd substitute feels for knows, because knowledge is evidence-based, whereas subjective knowledge is more accurately a feeling. So one's gender identity is who one subjectively feels oneself to be. Gender identity is a feeling. It's not surprising that H.R. 5 hedges to avoid defining gender identity. There are problems with protecting subjective feelings in civil rights legislation. First, people can lie about their feelings if it serves their purposes. A man could say he feels like a woman when he actually just has a sexual fetish for wearing feminine clothing, or so that he can be free to expose himself in a women's locker room, or be housed with the especially vulnerable women in a women's rape crisis center, or a women's prison, or win trophies and scholarships by competing against women in women's sports. Lying about feelings is a problem because claims of identity or feelings alone are not verifiable. Second, non-conforming people do not face discrimination because of their feelings, but because of their observed behavior. It is their perceived unfeminine or unmasculine behavior that needs protection under federal civil rights law. Ann Hopkins did not face discrimination based on her feelings or her identity. It was based on her observed behavior, and it was based on her female sex. Civil rights legislation that gives special protection to claimed feelings alone is bad legislation. And when it comes to achieving equal protection for unfeminine women and unmasculine men, it is not only unnecessary, but in fact detrimental to the principle of equal justice for all. The EFAA explicitly protects nonconformity in whole or in part with the sex role stereotypes traditionally assigned and enforced on the basis of sex. In doing so, it adds to the classes of people explicitly protected by federal civil rights legislation, and it does so rationally, clearly, and consistently with Price Waterhouse in a way that will be understandable by the public and defensible in court. The 2020 Supreme Court decision in Harris Funeral Homes against Stevens protected a male employee who informed his boss that, among other things, in future he would be dressing in feminine attire at work. The court could have protected his employment on the basis of the Price Waterhouse precedent, but instead it hung its ruling on transgender status while never even defining transgender, and crafted a badly confused ruling that begs for good legislation to supersede it. The EFAA would accomplish that. Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you for highlighting the protection of equal civil rights for people who do not conform to sex-based stereotypes, and that the EFA protects them. We are going to go into the Q&A, and wanted to start with a question here. They're starting to come in, and Kara's going to help me field some of these questions so we can bounce back and forth. And let's all of the panelists, if you would unmute and bring your cameras up, and we'll see who wants to answer what. Here's a simple one, a quick one. Let me just start with this. The fact that the phrase "of a female person" was used in the EFAA, and Kara, you had mentioned that. Would you like to, and they're wondering why that phrase is important. Would you like to answer that for us?
Oh, sure, I'd be happy to. Excuse me. It's a very good question, and I apologize if I didn't make that point clear earlier. But if you notice in the HR 5, right out of the gate, in point 1, the original text reads, and I quote, "Discrimination can occur on the basis of sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, or pregnancy, childbirth, or a related medical condition of an individual." The implication being that pregnancy, childbirth, or a related medical condition can be experienced by individuals who are not women, or by females who identify otherwise. We remove that dehumanizing language, and along with the term gender identity, and we asserted instead, and I quote, "Discrimination can occur on the basis of sex, sexual orientation, or nonconformity to sex-based stereotypes, or on the basis of pregnancy, childbirth, or a related medical condition of a female person." We did the same thing throughout our amended bill to clearly articulate the nature of motherhood as an exclusively female status, as affirmed in Article 2 of the Declaration. Does that answer the question?
Sounds good. Sounds very good. We have a very broad question. Thank you. We have a very broad question here that I think is going to bring a lot of clarity. The person is asking, can you explain the differences between your version of the act and the one put forward by the group Feminists in Struggle? I think a lot of us are having trouble knowing which one to support and to advocate for with our congressional representatives. And who would like to handle that? Lauren, would you like to handle that?
Sure. The fifth amendments, as I read them, has the word transgender and gender identity throughout. It's sprinkled throughout, and it's although it's redefined, it's redefined in a way that is not according to common usage. It doesn't need to be addressed. It doesn't need to be there. It doesn't, and it doesn't. It's not consistent, I would say, with certainly with the declaration that WHRC supports. Anybody else? Maybe somebody else would like to speak more broadly.
I could just jump in and add that I completely concur with what Lauren said, that the amendments put forth by Feminists in Struggle, WHRC USA cannot support them because they are inconsistent with the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights.
I'd like to add here what the approach that we took was to stay, and Lauren started us on this, was to stay as close to the original HR 5, the Equality Act, as we could, and just change what needed to be changed to get rid of gender identity and the harms it causes, and to keep the protections for lesbian and gay people and for those who do not conform to sex-based stereotypes. And that nonconformity to sex-based stereotypes, that phrase, instead of gender identity, covers everybody who doesn't conform. So, and to use the word transgender, we feel very strongly, and the WHRC is, in the UK is also advising us very strongly more and more to realize that the use of any of the language of gender identity ideology weakens our stance and gives credibility to the lie upon which transgenderism, gender identity is based. So we need to stay away from that language. I hope that helps. Anybody else want to add anything to that? Okay, I think we're good. So what are you hoping will be the next steps for the EFAA?
Should I take a stab at that one, Vajra?
Sure, go for it.
So we're very much hoping that anybody who's attending today, and really anybody who's a resident of the US, will be in contact with their US House representatives and senators. It's fairly easy to find them online with a simple Google search. And when you find them online, you can contact them and request a meeting with them. They'll probably send staff, and that's fine. And you can have an online meeting. And we're very much hoping that a representative or a senator will introduce the bill when Congress convenes in January. But those of us advocating for this don't have to wait till January to contact our representatives and senators. Some representatives and senators who are currently in office will not be returning in January for one reason or another. Maybe they lost their seat or they're retiring or whatever. Tulsi Gabbard is an example of that. But any of us who have representatives and senators who are returning in January can be in touch with them today, tomorrow, and to request a meeting or a conversation. You can share the actual document, which we put up earlier, and Vajra explained how to find online. And please just urge your representatives and senators to get it introduced in the next Congress so that we can at least have a national conversation about what these terms mean and the implications of enshrining gender identity in US law. I hope that answers the question.
Okay, good. Thank you, Kara. Here's a specific question. Why doesn't the EFAA say explicitly that women-only sports is not sex discrimination against men? Lauren, you want to handle that one?
Sure. It is discrimination. It does constitute discrimination against men. In some cases, sex discrimination is legal under both the Constitution and federal law. It's necessary to achieve a just result.
Okay, thank you. And this is a related, I think it's a related question. Why doesn't the EFA list specific women-only spaces and services that are exempt from men's claims of sex discrimination, such as public restrooms, changing rooms, rape crisis centers, women's prisons?
I'll answer that too. It's sort of associated. Because listing specific women-only spaces excludes others. It excludes other spaces that may arise that are not in the list. So being non-specific actually provides broader protection.
Related to that is the concept of bona fide occupational qualifications, which used to be a thing in medicine, and still some places is. It used to be that it was to be an ultrasound technician who did pelvic ultrasounds, you had to be female, you had to be a woman. It was considered a bona fide occupational qualification that women, if given a choice, would virtually always choose to have a woman do it, and that no one but a woman should do that for another woman. So, but again, it's a case by case basis, and there are certain things that are going to, that we can't even foresee that may turn out to have bona fide occupational qualifications where a woman is the only conceivable choice.
Okay, thank you. Someone did ask here, could you please share again how to find the WHRC proposal, the EFAA? And Kara mentioned that just a moment ago, but just to make it a little more clear, go to the womensdeclaration.com website, womensdeclaration.com, and you up at the top of the screen, you'll see countries. There's a menu at the top, countries, click on that, scroll down, find the US country, click on that, and you'll get to our page, our US country page, and you'll find the EFAA there. And someone is asking, what do you recommend for those of us who have already reached out to our congressional representatives but have received negative responses? We'd like to handle that.
Don't ever give up. Just don't give up. Do it again. Find another way about it. Look at you can go to your representative even if you are registered in another party. They still have to represent you. Find out about them. Find out what their background is, what causes they have championed in the past, what makes them tick, what will motivate them. One of the things that motivates them is getting reelected. So when you go to them, you want to do so, with a give and take in mind about, we're happy to help you get reelected, but you have to represent our interests and do it professionally and politely and go armed with the facts as much as you possibly can. But don't give up. Don't give up. Do it again. Do it again.
Yeah.
Vajra, may I jump in, Vajra? So in answer to the question in the Q&A box of where to find the EFAA, I posted a live link in answer to that question, and attendees should be able to see all the answered questions in the Q&A box. And if that's right, then you should be able to see the live link to the EFAA online.
Okay. If someone's asking for clarification, they say that I agree that transgender and gender identity should not be used, but isn't there a danger that non-conforming, etc., could also be used by those promoting gender identity? We'd like to clarify that.
Well, they are actually protected. I mean,
yeah.
All people belong to one of the two biological sexes, and the EFAA gives people all the protections of all the members of their sex, and that's what protection on the basis of non-conforming, non-conformity with sex roles is.
Yeah.
I think that I don't know. I mean, they're free to use that protection, regardless of how they identify. What's not protected is, as I mentioned, is claims to the same protections as the opposite sex.
Yeah.
Men who want to present
ahead.
as women should be protected. If they want to go around and present as what they feel women look like, I mean, they should be protected when they do that. So they should use it, and that's what it's there for. Sorry.
Right, and it's that phrase, that nonconformity to gender stereotypes, that does protect them. It just doesn't give them the right to claim to be the opposite sex, which is not a material reality and should not be imposed upon other people. It's a subjective belief or desire. We have another question here. Was it RBG, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who introduced the word gender into US law? If so, was she explicit that she meant it to be biological sex? Kara, I think you got the beat on that, don't you? Maybe?
Thanks for putting me on the spot. My understanding is that, yes, the late Ruth Bader Ginsburg did use the word gender in her advocacy when she meant sex. My understanding is that the reason that she did that is that she felt that the then all-male Supreme Court would be uncomfortable with a woman standing before them using the word sex. That's just my understanding. I'm not aware of any historical record of her thinking exactly on that. I'm not aware of any statements that she made explicitly as to her reasoning. And it's a bit difficult to speculate about what she thought because she's no longer with us and because of her ruling in the Bostock decision. So this is all a bit difficult to speculate about and to understand her reasoning. It's just hard. I'm just not aware of any record of her explaining why she made those decisions.
Thank you. It sure remains something of a mystery. So that was the best answer I think we could get about that and understanding her reasoning. There's a question, when we reach out to our representatives or senators, what are the main points we should discuss about the EFAA to be as concise as possible? And someone else was also asking, are there any talking points that they could get? So I think these are kind of related. How can we help?
Yeah, one
people
thing, and
there?
it kind of relates to what I was saying before, and there are others that others can jump in on. But again, when you go to them, is that they need to know that the loudest voices are not necessarily the most numerous voices, and that their constituency, by and large, absolutely does not support most of the excesses of, gender ideology. So that when you go to them, they need to know that we are your constituents, and 99% of us don't buy, and then you can list the excessive things. I don't know if anybody else has some other things to add to that as well.
What about these concise points that we could help people with? Somebody wants to get a
somebody else,
quick soundbite or something,
Kara or Lauren.
The three points are that the EFAA, first of all, I want to completely agree with what Marian said. Representatives and senators need to understand, especially Democrats need to understand, that the vast majority of people are not okay with men in women's prisons, are not okay with men in women's washrooms and restrooms and locker rooms. And use that language, right? Use that language. We are talking about men. When people talk about quote unquote trans women, they're talking about men. And when you ask the average person, do you think it's okay ask the question that's being posed in the UK often. Do you think it is okay for a man to be in a locker room with teenage girls? Do you think that's okay? Ask that question. Anyway, because the vast majority of people will say no. So that's to support what Marian was saying. The vast majority of people are with us on this, ultimately, once it's understood what we're dealing with. But the three main points to take away about the EFAA are: one, it protects women and girls on the basis of sex. Two, it protects lesbians, gay men, and bisexual people on the basis of sexual orientation. And three, it protects all people on the basis of nonconformity with sex-based stereotypes. Those are the three takeaways from the EFAA, I think, but anyone, please feel free to disagree.
I agree completely with what both Marian and Kara said. I also think it might be useful if you get enough time to talk about it beyond making those 3 points in terms of what's covered. It might be worthwhile talking about specific reports in the media of cases of violations, because a lot of people aren't aware that there have been crimes committed by by males presenting as females in some way or claiming the identity of a woman. And some of those cases are really awful. And I think they make an impression.
Yeah, I'd piggyback on that, Lauren, that the harms are real. The harms of gender identity being enshrined into law are real. They're not theoretical. They are happening. They are happening now. And there's plenty of documented incidents of women being housed in prison with men who are rapists and murderers who then claim to be a woman, and they're transferred over to women's prison. Young girls in public showers, like at public swimming pools and that sort of thing, having to shower next to a 45-year-old man with penis intact, a 12-year-old girl. These harms and the psychological harm to young girls who are told that the boy here in school, wants to be in the shower rooms with you and in the physical ed thing, because he says he's a girl. And the girls whose natural all young girls are aware that we're living in a rape culture. They feel it. They feel being sexually objectified. And then they're told by the culture, your feelings don't matter. Your feelings of unsafety, your feelings of modesty, your desire for bodily privacy. You have to undress in front of a boy. He undresses in front of you, and the culture doesn't care. You're wrong. That's a horrible message to send to young girls, and it imprints deeply. We all know, those of us who are adults, we know how deeply things imprint when you're an adolescent. So there's just numerous cases of the actual harm of enshrining gender identity and forcing people to accept a subjective feeling that somebody else has that is not based on reality, and you being forced by law to accept it. Anything else to add to that?
Yeah, if I could, I wanted to add just a little bit to your what you had to say there, Vajra. Of course, I agree with everything you said, but additionally, I wanted to make the point that from a very young age, girls learn what they need to be wary of. They learn that from everything around them, that they need to be wary and they need to be on guard and they need to carry themselves in a certain way and not be out after dark or whatever the implication is. And this ideology and the proponents of this ideology is telling them to ignore those warning signs. And that is dangerous. And it's gaslighting. I mean, everyone knows that you have to take these precautions if you're going to be existing in the world as it is today. Yes.
Right. Very real, very real. And also the harms to children, telling them they could be born in the wrong body. And you're going to be drugged now. And you are now deprived of a natural puberty, which is extremely important in the growing up into becoming an adult. These crises of adolescence is important in human development. But to be gaslit into thinking you could be born in a wrong body and then drugged for life. These are real harms. So plenty of harms to bring forward. Lauren, somebody's asking if you would like to talk about your experience with talking to staffers of your representative, because you already have done that. Is there anything you can share with us about that?
Yeah, I had a good conversation with a staffer of my congressional representative. My representative is in an interesting situation. He's a Democrat who was elected in a Republican district, and I think that perhaps because of that, he may be more open to arguments that are not necessarily part of the Democratic Party platform. In any case, I had a very positive response from his staffer, and we've had a number of communications back and forth, and I think that's a really good thing to do. It's good anyway to have a relationship with your local I think that that in particular, if you live in a district that's purple, like mine, that you have a really good shot of being heard.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you. They represent us, whether they're the same party or not. Here's a question that I think a lot of people are having to deal with. Situation. Please address that we find ourselves taking the same position as right-wing fundamentalists, and we get silenced by this association. How can we counter that as we present this bill?
Well, you know, there's a concept called false equivalency that says that if you have one thing in common with someone else, that you're the same as that someone else. And it's not true. I mean, you just have that one thing in common, although a lot of people think that if you have that one thing in common, it means you're the same, and you're not. You can keep explaining like we do over and over. It's like, no, we're just working together on this one thing, but we disagree about A, B, C, D, X, Y, Z. And having said that, it still doesn't let you off from doing the right thing. And if doing the right thing means that you're going to find yourself, you know, on the same side on one particular issue with people who you think are, you know, idiots besides that or whatever, you still do the right thing.
As I understand it, WHRC is a nonpartisan organization with respect to any political parties, and with respect to right or left. What WHRC does is it's if you look at its history and its actions.
Yeah.
Right, Lauren, that's exactly true.
Could I add something, Vajra?
Yeah, and then Carrie wants to talk too. So Carrie, go first, and then Carrie. Yeah.
Well, just to say, it has been my experience over the past couple of years that right-wing people and left-wing feminists, women, us, we land in the same place when it comes to our legislative and legal objectives. We come at it from different places, and that's okay. We land in the same place. But just in my experience over the past couple of years, as far as I'm concerned, it's not a terrible thing that conservative news sources, conservative media are quoting Andrea Dworkin, are quoting Mary Daly, are quoting Ruth Barrett, are quoting Vajra Ma. You know, it's not a bad thing that conservatives are quoting radical feminist analysis and sharing radical feminist analysis with their audience.
Thank you. Carrie.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something to that. For one thing, our detractors are always going to smear us in any way they can. That's just a low bar, easy way to try to discredit your point of view. As others have mentioned, WHRC USA is a nonpartisan organization. We don't align with the left or the right, conservative or liberal. We align with solid policy that's consistent with the Declaration. That is what we adhere to.
Thank you. Yeah. Here's an interesting question. When using cases, you know, of a harm and that sort of thing, should we discuss only those in the US or around the world? Since we are talking about, you know, the Equality Act, the Equality for All Act here in the US, I think it's a good question.
I'd love to know what others think of it, but my off-the-cuff response would be that it's good to stick with US examples, but that's not definitive. I would love to hear other thoughts on that.
If a case in another country is ahead of us, you know, if there's something that we think is brewing and on the horizon, and it has already presented and worked itself out in a certain way in another country, either good or bad, it probably is worth mentioning oh, you know what happened? That this is, they had the same thing in England. This is the law they passed. This is what happened, and it was good or it was bad or whatever. So if it's, if you can use it to illustrate a point or to address something that is, current, and being considered for legislation or for other big changes, then it's probably worth mentioning if you know enough about it.
Just
Yeah,
to underscore what Marion just said, the recent Kira Bell victory in the Tavistock case in the UK is extremely, extremely important. So I just want to say that I think I agree completely with Marion about that. It's a slightly different issue from the issue of men being abusive to women in women's prisons and shelters and things like that. If we're talking about those kinds of cases, like the Toronto case of the man who sexually abused all the women in the shelter, or if we're talking about Karen White in the UK, I would think that US legislators would be less interested in those cases than in US cases of the same thing happening. But Marion's absolutely right. If we're talking about Kira Bell's victory in the UK, that is huge, and that should resonate globally.
Agreed. I totally agree. And it's the turning of the tide. The tide is beginning to turn. And the thing that I think is really crucial is that the public doesn't know what's going on. The general public and parents, and that was of course deliberate. That was a tactical thing that to fly it under the radar of the public and parents. And so the fact that the tide is turning and the Kira Bell decision is really a sign of the tide turning. Is very heartening. Kara, you wanted to say something.
Yeah, just briefly, I wanted to just mention that if any of these things can be utilized to just show, to present them as a cautionary tale, I think they make very good points. This happened in so-and-so country. This is what they did. I think Marion addressed that. We don't want that to happen here. Kind of a thing. I think that it's reasonable to use those examples, perhaps not as effectively with our legislators, but certainly with the people we meet every day and with our family members when we talk about this. It's important that they know that this is a global fight, that this is happening everywhere. It's not unique to the US.
I imagine that, sorry, I
ahead,
imagine that the courts, I imagine that the federal judges are looking at cases such as the Kira Bell case that are coming down, maybe especially in English common law countries, as a guidepost to, as Marion said, to stuff that hasn't quite hit the courts here yet as legal questions. And it may be worth, it may be more worthwhile mentioning when you're talking to your legislators, talking about case law, such as Kira Bell and probably some others. Maybe that's more valuable than talking about Karen White, for instance. In other words, examples of bad stuff that's happened in other countries that may be of less value than major court decisions. Yes.
Great, thank you. Let's, I have one last question here, and then I would like to open it up for any of you panelists to have a last word that you would like to say or highlight from today, because we're 15 minutes after the hour here. This question is, has anyone found that there are more people on the left that have the same concerns? And if so, what is stopping them, politicians, left-leaning activists, from speaking out? How do we overcome this, not speaking out even though they have the same concerns that we have?
Not wanting to lose your job, rape and death threats. I mean, it can get pretty vicious. So, I mean, it's threats, and it's threats to your livelihood. It's I think everybody on this panel knows some woman who's lost her job because of speaking out. So yeah.
And might we use that fact that this censorship is horrendous, that the virulent threats indicate something about this whole movement that is unsavory. We might use that as some ammunition, you might say, to help convince a politician who's afraid to speak out to speak out. I mean, it's just, you know, it's hard to get someone to say something when you know they might lose their job, and this is career suicide. But still, the tenor of the attacks and the censorship that is happening against free speech is an important thing and something we might be able to use on our behalf. Kara.
I think that at this point, it's not an exaggeration to say that it would be impossible to overestimate the amount of capture that has happened. Institutional capture, legal capture, social capture. This movement has captured virtually every aspect of at least American society. It has captured our courts. It has captured our media. It has captured academia. It has captured our corporations. We've got corporations that are falling all over themselves to promote quote unquote trans non-binary, whatever. The capture is astonishing, and it is happening at a speed and with a force that even those of us who have understood the danger of this ideology for years did not predict. I think it's important I'll just include myself here. I've seen this happening for years, but I did not foresee the speed and force with which this would capture all of our institutions. And so to go against it is almost complete suicide in every way. But I guess if I have one last thing to say, I'll say it's liberating to speak the truth. And to quote Magdalene Burns, you know, I'd rather be rude than a liar. I took out her expletive. But it's
You know,
one thing to add to what Kara had to say, and that's that this was instituted, this whole phenomena was instituted in stealth by design. And people often miss that. Jennifer Bielek has done such tremendous work in exposing that if you could become more familiar about those entities that are funding and pushing this agenda, it's really helpful in your advocacy.
You know, this is bringing up, there's another question or a statement, which is right along what we're talking about right now. And this woman is asking, in addition to pressing our US reps, does it help to start grassroots campaign with local reps and school boards? Even with Kira Bell example, perhaps because if we can't get through to the US reps, we may need to revert to the local level. And I think she's spot on. The public doesn't know, and we need to get more and more grassroots. Put stickers up, put posters up in bathroom stalls, in the bulletin boards at grocery stores. Hand something to the grocery clerk, you know, that you have a flyer handy that explains what's going on, because people don't know. You talk to the average person, they go, what? Of course, they don't believe you because it's too ridiculous, you know, and they don't know. And so I'm grateful for that question. Anybody want to address that? Mary, you look like you want to say something about that.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's how institutional capture happens. That's how it starts. That's how it happens. I mean, you know, political parties do it. Gender ideology did it. That's how you capture institutions, is you start at really local levels. So, I mean, you know, people run for these local offices and you think, oh, what's the big deal? But then in these local offices, they they then have authority to do things like change the way elections are run, the way people are nominated, to change laws that have ripple effects down the line. So that's how institutional capture happens.
I just wanted to add also that school boards and at the local level do not want to release that information to just anyone. So we're hoping that we can work with our state contacts to consolidate some of that information and share it with us so we can get some kind of a, a tracking system done about where this is happening. A parent in the system is much more likely to be able to get that information about what is being taught to their children than an outsider just asking for it. They just flat out say no, they won't do it. So yes, it has to be local advocacy, and school boards are real, or even an individual elementary school is a good starting point to find out what they're teaching children, and starting to raise a ruckus about it if it's something that's not appropriate or harmful.
Yeah, just to add to what Carrie said, I think that that the transing of kids, of minors, is dynamite. It's dynamite. It's like it's the most horrendous piece of this whole movement, and it's the most likely to outrage large numbers of people if only they knew that that children were being indoctrinated with this stuff through the public schools. And I have a fantasy. You know, I'm not a parent. I don't have kids, or grandkids or anything. You know, I have no connection with the public schools. But I have a fantasy of a PTA militia just raising a ruckus and being in the streets over this, because it's outrageous, and I think it outrages most people, especially the issue of drugging and mutilating these children.
Yeah, organized angry parent groups are a sleeping giant that needs to be awakened.
So can I just say, if the question is about schools and the indoctrination of children, I will just share that a friend recently shared with me that she had submitted an Information Act request under her state's law. I can't say what state, but she shared the information she got back, and the information had to do with the curriculum being put forward to kindergartners. And the information to kindergartners, the message was, some people have a gender identity that is different. The indoctrination is starting early. It's extremely early. It's extremely distressing to those of us who care about children. If the question is, what can I do locally? Absolutely, please act locally. Please act with the school board. Please look up your state's Information Act, Public Information Act, Freedom of Information Act. These things are called different things in different states, but you can look it up and you can get the information. And absolutely, please do that locally and statewide. It's going to be, this is a huge fight for all of us. And then just to bring it back, you know, not to detract from local or state-based advocacy. That is absolutely critical. Please do that. Please advocate with your local city council people, your county supervisors, your school boards, and your state legislatures. But just to bring it back, just the purpose of tonight was just to talk about the EFAA and how we really hope it gets introduced in the incoming convening Congress as an alternative, a clean alternative to HR 5 that protects women and girls on the basis of sex, lesbians and gay men and bisexual people on the basis of sexual orientation, and everybody on the basis of nonconformity with sex-based stereotypes.
Thank you. Thank you for bringing it back, Kara. Yeah, excellent discussion. Just a quickie, Kara Bell, someone just know who that is. It's spelled Keira BELL. You can look at it, you can Google it, you can find out what the significance of that is. I don't think we have time to go back into it here, but I wanted to address the fact that someone's going, what, Carabelle, how do you spell it? What is it? You know, so it's hard to keep up with all the news, I know. So it's almost, you know, an hour and a half here. So I think we've pretty much covered what we need to for this webinar. Any last words by anybody on the panel? Kara kind of wrapped it up for us. And we're encouraging you. What I want to say is get more signatories to the Women's Declaration, because the grassroots is the people. And we need more women awake and in solidarity, and make our voice stronger globally and here locally in the US, so that we can go out and say, look, here's the EFAA, and I represent, you know, this represents the voice of so many thousands of women in the US. I think 1,000 signatories now, maybe more. So get somebody else to sign and share it with your friends and neighbors, and know that each of us has the power to increase this and increase our voice. Any last words by anybody else here on the panel?
I think he wrapped it up well, Vajra.
Okay. Let's keep working together. Thank you everybody for being here. Thank you for the fantastic questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them. And go to www.womensdeclaration.com, click on our country page and get that EFAA, and go for it with your senators and reps and your local representatives too. Okay, thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye for now. Thank you, everyone on the panel.